Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kimberly Crenshaw, Executive Director of the African American Policy Forum. Together with the Center for Intersectionality and Social Policy Studies, we want to welcome you to this urgent webinar, Social Justice SOS, what we need to know about, what happened, what's coming, and why we must join together against hate. Thank you for joining us. I'm sure I'm not alone in confessing that the trauma that many of us have been experiencing over the last 18 months, now culminating with the election Tuesday, has been utterly debilitating. The White House will soon be occupied by someone who stoked fears and anxieties of the entire nation, promising to ban Muslims, to build a wall to keep out undocumented Mexican workers. And together with a vice president who's opposed marriage equality, our new president has mocked people with disabilities, boasted about his own sexually assaultive behavior, stoked racist narratives about widespread injustice perpetrated by minorities against white Americans, and has brought white nationalism to the forefront. Events since Tuesday only reinforce the sense that these forces that have been unleashed during this campaign won't be dampened by electoral success. As Harry Reid has recently said, I've personally been on the ballot in Nevada for 26 elections, and I've never seen anything like the reaction to the election completed last Tuesday. The election of Donald Trump has emboldened the forces of hate and bigotry in America. Now, across the country, we've heard stories about individuals who've been assaulted. A woman in a hijab who was walking down the street and told, "Your time is up." A gay man who was verbally attacked with a homophobic slur in a coffee shop by a man who said, holding up a middle finger, "This is our America now." Children who have been chanting, who have been receiving chants such as "Build the Wall." Young Latino students at school and others who've been sent home to parents in utter distress after being told that they and their families will be sent out of the country they know as home. This fear is real. But beyond the palpable evidence of this sharp return to scapegoat politics is what may be a more debilitating emergence of what we might call normalization. So around the country, pundits and others have been urging us to deny the monstrous politics of hate that have been reshaping the social landscape. Racism, xenophobia, patriarchy, homophobia, ableism, all the isms have explicitly been on display throughout the campaign, but suddenly this has all been neutralized. So we now live in a world in which race, gender, and other identities can be mobilized to fan the flames of hate, but those of us who have been targeted cannot call these things out for what they are. So now hate has emerged as an effective intersectional weapon, while our resistance is made into parochial spasms of paranoia. So one thing we know without a doubt is that we need each other now like never before. We need to share our collective sense of what happened, what will happen, and where we must draw the line to build a collective movement of resistance. So to do that, we're joined by an extraordinary group of commentators, all who responded to our urgent request to share their wisdom, passion, and direction for a way forward. In fact, the response was so overwhelming that in lieu of lengthy introductions to all of them, we asked you to find their bios on our website, www.aapf.org. We also ask you to bear with us. We have put this together in 24 hours. So we are happy to have you and looking forward to getting into the conversation. So here's how it's going to work. We will begin hearing from Tim Weiss, Sumi Cho, Devin Carbato, Robin Kelly, and Zila Eisenstein, who will each give us a snapshot about how to think about what happened. Between so many competing explanations, what is it that we can say, and how do we need to be informed to protect our communities? We urge you to chat and tweet your own observations, and we'll pause after we hear from them to give voice to some of your responses. We'll then segue into what is poised to happen concretely in terms of policy outcomes and consequences for our constituencies, from immigration to LGBTQ+, to Indigenous communities standing firm and standing rock. Trumpism has promised to undermine the struggles of people everywhere. So we want to talk about what the real threats are. Here we're going to hear from Hiroshi Motomura, Ashley Bali, Ezra Young, Dallas Goldtooth, and Mary Frances Berry. Finally, we're going to come together in this moment, not to wring our hands, but to lay out a broad vision about moving forward, lifting up the vital work that we are doing and must all do more between and amongst ourselves. Here, we're going to talk about how to respond to this moment. And we'll hear from Alicia Garza, Sherelle Brown, and Eve Ensler. Again, it's important to hear from you. So throughout this town hall, please reach us by tweeting at AAPF, AA Policy Forum, or through the chat function here on Zoom. We'd also encourage you to expand the conversation across social media by following AAPF on Twitter and Facebook using the hashtag #SocialJusticeSOS. So let's get into the conversation. If we are to effectively push back against what's been unleashed by Trump in this election, we have to understand how they were able to prevail. There have been so many competing explanations, so many rationalizations. We want to know what we now know, what we can say, and how it should inform our efforts moving forward. So I want to go first to Tim Wise. Tim, tell us how we should understand the role of white racial anxiety and resentment, or even to put it out there, white nationalism and racism in bringing Donald Trump to the White House.
Well, first off, Kim, thank you for inviting me to this and involving me in this. It's great to be with you and a lot of other wonderful people who I admire. It's unfortunate that it's under these circumstances, but I think it's important for us to have this conversation. There's some things we know, some things we don't. One thing, the point you made in the introduction about how vital it is not to normalize Trumpism is very true. And yet we also have to remember how incredibly normal this moment is if we look at American history. You know, Carol Anderson's recent book, White Rage, which is a brilliant book looking at the way in which every step forward in this country's history for people of color has been met by this kind of rage-filled backlash against that movement. So whether we're talking about the end of enslavement and Reconstruction, met with Jim Crow, black codes, vagrancy laws, convict lease programs, the Great Migration, met with riots and lynching, desegregation, met with white flight, white academies, et cetera, massive resistance, all the way up to the election of President Obama being met with, and the browning of America, right, being met with Trumpism, birtherism, take our country back, make America great again. So in one sense, this is not all that new, right? In one sense, it is just a more extreme iteration of a longstanding sort of pastime. But we do need to parse and figure out how the white nationalism piece played out here. And it's not always as obvious as it might seem. I think there's no question that Trumpism, the foundation, if you think of it like the building of a house, right? The foundation of this house was without question an incipient white nationalism. Not necessarily the David Duke variety of that, or what now they call the alt-right variety, but a clearly incipient white nationalism. It started with birtherism for Donald Trump. It then moves on to, you know, the speech bashing Mexican migrants, moves on to Muslims. Even the attacks on China for trade was very much a racialized narrative about the other. So that's the foundation of the house. It's not enough to have propelled him to the presidency. I think if that is all he's been able to do, he wouldn't have won. But you can't build a house without a foundation, which is to say you can't understand Trumpism without that appeal to white racism, anxiety, and resentment. In addition to that, of course, he adds on white evangelicals, who often have a racist narrative and a white nationalist frame as well, but they're principally motivated by these hyper-patriarchal Christian hegemonic concerns about abortion, making sure Kim Davis can do her thing in Kentucky, overturning Obergefell, et cetera. You add to that these so-called economic anxiety voters, and I want to be real precise when we think about them, because that's the narrative the mainstream media is going to try to give us. And I think it's critical to remember a couple things. This can't just be about economic anxiety or the loss of jobs, because if that were the case, black and brown folks would have flocked to Donald Trump. They're twice as likely to be employed, 3 times as likely to be poor. So when we talk about white economic anxiety, even though I think it's a thing and it's real in the Rust Belt and elsewhere, it can't be divorced from the backdrop of white racial expectationalism and entitlement. In other words, white folks, and particularly white men, have been told all their lives, as long as you were strong and had a strong back and could lift stuff, you'll always have work. Black and brown folks always knew that wasn't true. But white men had the luxury of believing the narrative, and then when that narrative doesn't work anymore, because of globalization, because of the loss of manufacturing jobs, they uniquely are ill prepared for it. So is it economic anxiety? Yes, but it is interconnected intimately with a white cultural racial anxiety and an expectation and entitlement mentality. What we're really seeing, if you think about all those groups I mentioned, the Christian right evangelicals, the hyper patriarchal, we want an alpha male, folks in the manosphere and all that stuff who were big Trump supporters, or whether it's the white nationalist type, every single one of them is essentially responding to what they perceive as a loss of hegemony, right? If you've had hegemony, all of a sudden to not be the absolute norm anymore, if you've had 100% to only have 90 or to only have 80 or to only have 70 feels like oppression, right? So the irony of this is the system of inequality, white supremacy, Christian hegemony, straight supremacy, all of those things set these groups up to expect a permanence of power and hegemony. And they are now backlashing, or as Van Jones said, white lashing against that. So we have to understand the intricacies of these things, the way that they intersect. And I think if we do that, we can begin to fashion some strategies for response to what Carol Anderson in her recent book calls white rage.
Yes. Thank you, Tim, and thank you especially for the shout out to Carol Anderson, whose work cannot be more highly recommended to anyone who wants to understand what's happening here. I also want to put a point on what you just said about both the foundation and the baseline, the expectation against which any diminishment is seen as an injury. Luke Harris calls this diminished overrepresentation. So when you are expected to have 100%, 80% feels like a loss, and a loss to go to the mat to defend, this idea of diminished overrepresentation. So building then on what we've heard, the foundation of supremacist expectations, I want to bring Sumi into the conversation. So Sumi, a lot was made about this being the moment when a new coalition would come together, a lot about women, and we heard a lot about the suburban women who were going to part company and vote differently. And yet it appears, if we can believe the national exit polls, and that will be a question for us to consider, that 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. Relative to larger, in the case of African-American women, overwhelming numbers voting for Hillary Clinton. So I guess the best way to put it is, what does this tell us about the state of intersectional feminism?
Well, I think it tells us that it's a very sorry state of intersectional feminism that we're facing right now by that troubling statistic. And while 53% of white women supporting Donald Trump in light of his history, comments, and actions is truly astounding and disturbing, I want to suggest that it actually may be worse than has been portrayed, because Latinos and Asian American women likely supported Clinton and voted against Trump in far higher numbers than has been reported by the exit polls conducted by the National Election Pool. So how did this happen? Well, exit poll surveys aren't designed to actually reach representative samples of groups like Asian Americans and Latinos. And so we end up having one major national exit poll conducted for the National Election Pool, which all the major media outlets use. And the method that they use, it's conducted by Edison Research in particular, the method they use surveys Asian Americans and Latinos in a way that's statistically more likely to capture Republicans. How? Well, mainstream pollsters too often use too small a sample to be reliable. They don't construct samples that reflect the diversity within those communities, and they don't conduct interviews in Asian languages or Spanish at the first contact or ever. And so these practices taken together bias the sample because they tend to miss those in the polls that are more likely to be Democrats, that is immigrants, native language dominant, lower SES, younger voters. And so if you compare what's been said about the Latino vote, for example, by the national election poll, it said that they voted 29% for Trump, which is truly surprising since he wants to build a wall, right, to keep them out, you know, and 65% for Clinton. But if you look at the Latino decisions polling, which was done by a number of coalitional groups that have expertise in reaching out to this community, it's more like 79% Clinton, 18% Trump. And when you look at Latinas, it's even higher, of course, with the gender gap, 86% Clinton, 12% Trump. APA population similarly, instead of 65% Clinton, 29 Trump, it was really 75-19. And when you look at women, 79-17. So finally, if you break out Jewish women from the category of white women, Jews voted 71-24, right, for Clinton over Trump, leaving white Protestant women voting 32% Clinton, 64% Trump. And so when you go into the narratives, you know, I think there's all these theses out that's being captured by like the New York Times trying to figure out what it did wrong in missing this election. And so you hear these dominant narratives of, oh, there's a sort of Ivanka voter, or there's this kind of good father, beautiful family thesis, or I want my daughter to be a successful businessman type of thesis. But buried at the back of that same New York Times article on the women who helped Donald Trump to victory, it finally gets to the issue of race, if you're still reading, and it states that these white women supporters of Trump are troubled by an America that seems to have embraced multiculturalism and political correctness without question. And they said they didn't understand the Black Lives Matter movement. They wondered why Democrats seemed so fixated on transgender access to bathrooms and tended to be enraged at the way veterans are treated and violence directed at the police, and that they were concerned about immigration and the threat of terrorism. And so it helps explain why all of the sexist, misogynistic, xenophobic comments and actions never disqualified Trump from being eligible to be president for these voters because of their commitment to a very racialized patriarchy.
Mm-hmm. Well, so Zila, I want to bring you in on this since we are talking about the state of intersectional feminism. And in one sense, much of what we just heard from Sumi is in some ways a continuation of the fact that the voting constituency behind a gender justice agenda has never been majority white. For the last several presidential election cycles, white married women have gone with the Republican ticket. Those who have been consistently counted on to embrace a gender justice agenda have largely been women of color. Is there anything new, frustrating, disturbing about what we've just seen, particularly given the campaign that was run and women being on the top of this ticket?
Well, you know, what's new is, you know, you had Hillary Clinton as the candidate for the Democrats. What was new is that there was such limited choice for so many, no matter what their color. I mean, Black women voted for Hillary Clinton, not in full support of her, but definitely against Trump. So there were plenty of white women. What my question is about some of the people, the 53% of white women who voted for Trump, I am wondering if part of that was also the politics of voting against Hillary Clinton, which would make the vote a bit more complex as to exactly what is the place of misogyny and racism and class privilege. So I would want to go back to just rethinking some really old stuff for what feels like a new moment, and it is, just because it is new. And that's really to think through the incredible struggle by women of color to really change the women's movement in the United States for it's almost a half century now. And the Black women who, you among them, Kim, Barbara Smith, Bell Hooks, Beverly Guy Sheftel, I mean, saying the white women's movement is racist, it's white dominated, it's not about us, and we weren't, we're not there any longer. But Hillary Clinton and the politics of this moment in terms of this election was. So I really appreciated the discussion just before, giving the complexity to the different voting, the complexity of the voting and what we don't know about it. And I would just want to think really hard and long about what new coalitions can be built in this moment because of some of the strategies that particularly women of color were forced to use to, to really fight against Trump. So I don't want to give up the incredible movement that has happened in feminism just because of the wreckage that Hillary Clinton's campaign has left us with. And I'm not looking to blame here. It's just the wreckage that I think we need to find the best radical potential that we can get out of it.
Right, exactly. So let me move to our last two folks on this conversation to get bookends, as it were. So we heard about what the baseline was of entitlement and loss of privilege. We heard about the complicated, but notwithstanding that fact that so many women voted in a way that in some ways just was surprising, but in other ways is perfectly consistent with what has been going on before. Now I want to bring in Robin Kelly and then Devin Carbato to talk about sort of the deep background and what's happening now. So one of the things that actually is somewhat puzzling, particularly when I talk to people from outside the country, they don't get this electoral college business. And those who do get the electoral college business use it as a way of saying that there wasn't anything particularly amiss or racial about how we elect presidents. So one question is, what do we need to understand historically about the Electoral College in relationship to white supremacy? Is it just a neutral mechanism? It might be thought about differently, but is it the case that it's just an exaggeration to try to tell a history about the Electoral College that links it to white supremacy? And if not, then what is truly the story behind the Electoral College? What's its relevance today? So I'm going to pitch that to you, Robin. Robin, are you unmuted?
Why, Kimberly, why are you getting Robin? Can I try to answer the question?
Mary Frances Berry, so lovely to hear your voice. Please do, welcome.
When you get Robin, I'll shut up, okay?
No, don't shut up at all.
I want to say two things. Let me just say that the first thing is on the Electoral College. They didn't call it a college, but the framers, when they put that in there, they did it in a response to the southern states, which wanted the 3/5 compromise that we all know about, making black folks 3/5 of other persons, and who wanted their states protected from more population in the north and so on. So it was put in there as a mechanism to even out the impact that they would have. And once slavery was abolished, it was already in there, and it hasn't been taken out, and it benefits states, as we can see from the election. And it's done it 4 times in American history. One was the Hayes-Tilden election in '76. After that, Cleveland and Harrison, and then everybody should remember Bush v. Gore. And now this time, and what it benefits is all those states we see on the map that don't have the population, but in fact, because of their representatives and their 2 senators, they get to have an impact in this so-called electoral college. The problem is, you say, well, why don't we get rid of it? Just like my friends who say, why don't we get rid of states' rights? What is this about the 10th Amendment? The states ought not to have the right to do anything. Let the federal government do it. You need a constitutional amendment. And to get a constitutional amendment, you need 3/4 of the states to ratify it. And of course, the ones that benefited ain't going to ratify it, okay?
That's
if I
right.
could put that
That's
in case. And can I say another thing quickly while I'm here? I know I'm messing up here, whatever. But the arguments about why what happened, which I listened to, if it wasn't all racism, okay? Race is connected to economics, we know that. But it wasn't all racism. Take the white women. Some of them, they didn't just have false consciousness, or may not have been racist, but they looked at their sons and daughters who are grown, sleeping in the basement because they don't have a job, and thought about all those college monies they paid, and they were fooled by all this talk about how things were going to be great economically, and were hoping that these grown kids of theirs would have a better life. Some of them did that. So they were misled. The message is mixed. The other thing is, when you say it's all about racism, and a lot of it was about racism, and we have to mobilize against that, and sexism, is that you leave out the fact that lots of Latinos voted for this guy more than voted for Romney. And the ones who did, when they were asked, some of them in the exit polls said it was about economics. So it is about racism, and we have to fight the racism. But if you don't understand why something happened, and none of us understand clearly in particular why it happened, you can't work against it if you're not really clear about what's going on.
Thank you. So before I go to you, Devin, I want to circle back to Tim and Asumi, specifically on how do we understand that it's not all about racism, particularly through an intersectional lens? So what do we make of what Mary Frances Berry pointed out? Like, so many of the women, we're seeing sons in basements that, they will never get out of. And, more or less seeing their relationship to them. I know, Tim, you have some thoughts about that. And Sumi, this is an argument that you've encountered when we were mobilizing to protect affirmative action. So could you both really, really quickly just share your thought about that?
Sure. Well, really quickly, I think Mary Frances Berry's right. She's always right, I should point out.
No.
Things she said. But I just want to supplement it by saying, as I was saying before, the thing about racism and the way it works within white communities currently is it is linked to this economic expectationalism, right? So if white families were the ones who didn't think their kids would be coming back, who didn't think their kids would have a hard time finding work, then they are going to have an anxiety that black and brown communities already know what the job market is like. They've never had the expectation or the sense of entitlement that said, oh, our kids are definitely going to be better off than we're going to be. I mean, black and brown folks have never had that luxury. White America did. And so I think, even though it is totally true that the economic sort of shock of a changing economy is part of what's going on, I think we can't disentangle that from the fact that white folks, and pretty much white folks alone, were encouraged to believe that that would never happen to us, and that amplifies the sense of injury.
And Asumi, building on that, your experience in writing about white women in the context of affirmative action, this is not a new set of arguments, right?
Right.
No, it's not. And so we saw a lot of those same narratives in many of the affirmative action state ballot initiatives, that is, to outlaw affirmative action in particular states, including Washington, California, Michigan, et cetera. And what that narrative revealed, because the Democrats then also had a similar strategy of pinning a lot of their strategic hopes on the backs of white women and were bitterly disappointed when those efforts did not pay off is that the assumption that white women would vote on the basis of their own individual economic interest really did not play out when you matched it up with the exit polling data that captures the exact kind of comment that Mary Frances Berry referred to, that instead of actually voting on the basis of individual women's, whether be it white women's or women of color's economic interests, since white women were the greatest beneficiaries of affirmative action, at least in the state of Washington, right? Instead, you heard this narrative of, but I'm concerned about what it will do to my son, my brother, my husband, etc. So you have this concept of family that's highly racialized that overwhelmed and supplanted the common, sort of rational voter approach to interest.
So thank you for that, Cindy. And before we get too far, I want to now bring Devin into this. So, we've been talking about how the election is a culmination of a lot of dynamics that we've seen in recent history and all the way back to the founding of the Republic. But there is now a response that seeks to normalize this election. And in particular, that these kind of conversations are precisely the things that we have to worry about as we move to a more peaceful transition of power. So what is your response to this? What should be our response to this? How do we think about this moment of neutralizing what got us here, normalizing it as we move forward?
So I think it is surprising to me the extent to which there is this quick move to normalization. And it's surprising not just because it happens, but from the quarters from which it is happening in, which is to say, it's happening even in the context of liberal contexts, and it's certainly happening all over the media. So I might understand, I might understand why President Obama would extend an olive branch to Donald Trump in the context of discussing the peaceful transition of power. I might understand that. What I don't understand is why the peaceful transition of power requires the normalization of the moment. Presumably we can have the peaceful transition of power and political contestation of the particular constellation of power that we are likely to see across the three branches of government under a Trump presidency. Why can't we talk about that? And it might be particularly important that we talk about the politics of protest in this kind of moment, precisely because of the way racial change has typically occurred in the United States. It's not as though racial change occurs in moments of get-alongism, in moments of harmony. Racial change occurs when there's disruption, when there are people willing to draw lines. It's not as though America says to African Americans in particular, tell us what you want, we will give it to you, and why didn't you tell us this earlier? That's not how it happens. And this moment of closing ranks, this normalizing moment, elides the ways in which racial change has historically occurred. And part of the pernicious way in which this has happened, which again, to me, it's quite surprising, is the race-neutral, colorblind explanations that are being proffered for this particular electoral result. So I spent far too much time yesterday, as many of you have presumably, watching television in a state of grief and mourning. And in that context, I was trying to take note of what people were offering up to account for this particular result. So here some of what people were saying. It's about the year of the outsider, which is to say, it's not about race. It's about the fact that Trump had a positive message, not about race. It's about the difficulties of effectively winning a third term. It's about popularism. It's about anti-establishment of politics. It's about Republicans finally coming home. It's about people not making Trump's negative a deal breaker. Now we can pause and ask ourselves whether these are truly race-neutral explanations, but let's accept them as race-neutral explanations and try and understand why there is this investment in eliding race against the backdrop of a very racialized campaign. That I completely do not understand, or perhaps I do. So some of you are familiar with the Shaggy song, It Wasn't Me. So if racism could narrate its own song in this moment, it would say something like, so you caught me red-handed, it wasn't me. So you saw me at the Trump rallies, it wasn't me. So you heard me in the streets every day, it wasn't me. There's a kind of disavowal that's happening in this particular moment that I find quite shocking. And it's a disavowal, it seems to me, that's consistent with the way in which we continue to sweep race under the rug. And this too is not new. Think about the context in which Obama won. Immediately after he won, what did we do? We ushered in the moment of post-racialism. So something quite similar is going on here. It's a different kind of disavowal, to be sure, but it's a disavowal nonetheless. And I want to say one thing to take us back to the intersectionality point before shutting up, and it is this. What's striking to me about the conversation about white women is that we have to keep in mind that the white women vote occurs against three important backdrops. One, you have a man on record of not just saying sexist things, but doing misogynistic things. B, you have a woman who's on record of saying pro-feminist things and doing pro-feminist things. C, she's not anybody's radical. So it's not as though you have a real radical in Hillary Clinton. And it's against those three backdrops in a way that trying to understand the white woman's vote becomes crucial. My own thinking is that we have not sufficiently interrogated white women's relationship to whiteness. And I think that needs to be more squarely on our political agenda. It's not to say that that is the explanation to core for where white women are in this particular electoral cycle. There are other things going on, and the other speakers have named that. But I do think we need to not hesitate, not be shy about, and speak truth to power with respect to the way in which whiteness historically has constituted whiteness identity and the extent to which that continues to play itself out in the context of contemporary politics.
Thank you, Devin. I think you've given us a theme song for this webinar. It wasn't me. If we had that queued up, we would have been playing it along with what you're saying. And to just sort of to build on that, I mean, we were talking the other day, and I mentioned that there was something like this moment that felt like the Rodney King moment. It first of all, when there was finally a beating that was caught on film, many of us thought, so the conversation about whether police brutality happens is over, and we can now move to what to do about it. And then with the acquittal of the officers, there was like, my God, even seeing it doesn't move the conversation to confrontation with the reality. And that's very much what it feels like happened now. So racism, xenophobia, every phobia we can think about was clearly on display, yet it was virtually impossible to get people to continue to focus on it. And now that it has actually created exactly what Trumpism hoped, we're to assume that it's not real, or it really didn't do it, or, you know, it has now sort of evaporated into the ether. So thanks for giving us a way of thinking and remembering how this is moving. So I want to thank everybody for getting us started and move just shortly to what is going to happen and hear from our next set of people. I'm going to ask Cynthia in the meantime, just give us a few tweets about what we've been hearing so far, and then we'll hear from our next group of speakers. Cynthia?
Hi, Kim. Thanks for checking in. So we've got a lot of great comments coming in on Twitter. Thanks to everyone who sent in their great questions and considerations. So we've got a few highlights from our audience. Jasmine GM at JGET Moore is currently doing some work, thinking, being, planning. Thank you, Jasmine, for being a part of this. I hope you're learning as much as I am. From Andrea Delgado at Andrea Delgado 7, because we can't stop, won't stop fighting. Thank you for your motivating words, and we hope you continue to fight with us. Folks, please keep sending us your tweets and comments. We'll check back in again at the end of our second conversation.
Thanks, Cynthia. So I want to move to put on the table and put in conversation with what we just heard, some of the concrete things that might be at stake. I want to go to Hiroshi first. And, you know, Donald Trump made a lot of outrageous campaign statements. I want to know what you are most concerned about, particularly because now he has the power of executive action. And he has a Congress that is prepared to move legislatively in that direction as well. So what do we have to be concerned about now?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so as you said, he made a lot of outrageous campaign statements. There's the wall, the discrimination against many sorts of Muslim immigrants, deporting 11 million undocumented. But as I think you're suggesting, there are a lot more specific proposals that are at least as troubling because frankly, they're more doable and practical than the statement made. So what comes most immediately to mind? I think about this in terms of what can he do, what power does the president have, what can he do unilaterally, and what can he do only if he gets someone else to go along. And then I could talk about who those other people might be as to certain proposals. So I want to start with what I think concerns a lot of people, about 800,000 people right now, people who have deferred action for childhood arrivals and the work permits that came along with those. Trump pledged to end it. And this is something that he has the power to do, but exactly how that's going to happen is not clear to me. The worst case is immediate revocation and pulling back all the employment authorization documents. I have to say that the best case is that he lets it lapse, which would mean that people would have those work permits and be able to continue to work and have status. And that leads to all kinds of things for several years. There's a big issue of the use of the confidential information that was provided in DACA applications. And so that I'm sure will be litigated. But he can do this because it was President Obama who did this as executive action. So this has led to a lot of concerns, as you might imagine, in communities and families, hard questions for individuals based on their situations. There's a lot of need for information. I'm involved in several nonprofits that are heavily trying to get this information out to communities. I think it's also an important context for reassurance and building a community. There are other things that a president can do, and they, of course, involve deportation policy, how that's executed, and including raids, which I'm afraid may become more common, at least as much as they were in the George W. Bush administration. Refugee cutoffs within executive action. There's also a lot of proposals for things in Congress. He has pledged to cut off funding for sanctuary cities. There's, of course, the border wall, although there is a border wall already. And then there's also a lot more damage that can be done with the legislative landscape. Who's let in? What are the rules of deportation? We should remember that under the Bill Clinton administration, Congress passed and Bill Clinton signed into law a very draconian set of rules, which in many, many ways made it easier to deport people, made it harder to get in, and things of that nature. And so those are all things that that could happen. If you want, I can get into what limits him, but I know I'm at over 3 minutes. So if you want me to go on, I will. But if you want to come back to me, I can sort of talk about sort of what limits him from what it is that he might do.
Yes, thank you, Hiroshi. And we will come back to you. We know we're losing you soon, and so we want to come back and get a sense of what opposition might look like. But first, let me go to Osli and ask, so, right alongside his denigration of Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants, is his denigration of Muslim and Muslim American communities. So what is the likely impact of this election on Muslim and Muslim American communities?
Thanks so much, Kim, again, for having all of us and for putting together this great group. I think that, in the immediate term, what we'll see is what we've already begun to see, and you described at the very beginning, the kind of harassment of people who are identifiably Muslim. This especially impacts women who wear headscarves. Mohajaba students of mine have already begun to describe the uptick as a consequence of the election campaign, and it's gotten much worse since the election day itself. And clearly there's also, and related to the comments Hiroshi was making, another set of immigration proposals that were part of Trump's campaign, including the banning of travel by Muslims, and also the registering of Muslims, by religion who are already present in the United States. And all of these are of very deep concern. I think for the Muslim community right now, this moment feels worse than the post 9/11 aftermath. And there are a couple of reasons for that. The first of those is that there were more checks in place in the immediate prequel, and as a result, in the immediate aftermath of 9/11 on the Bush administration, and the Bush administration systematically eliminated some of those and produced a narrative that already normalized the conception that Donald Trump now taps into. So it's a sequencing problem whereby Trump now comes in after we've had a relentless 15 years, 8 years of which were marked by significant executive action that constructed a war on terror, much of which remains in place today, despite the 2 terms of the Obama administration, and that can be built upon. So it's worse in that sense. It's also worse in the sense that immediately after 9/11 in 2001, there were also international checks of a variety of kinds that are no longer in place, both as a result of the way that the international order has been reconfigured by the war on terror, and because allies themselves are undergoing very similar domestic processes themselves. And so this fits into a broad international script, and it's an international script of a global authoritarian arc where we're seeing this kind of nativist politics succeed and pay dividends over and over again in countries falling like dominoes. And with the fall of the United States as the largest domino in the international system, that trend is going to radically accelerate. You saw far-right nativist groups all around Europe celebrating Donald Trump's presidential election and viewing it as a harbinger of what they will be able to accomplish in their own home countries. So this is affecting Muslims directly as Muslim Americans. It's affecting Muslims who might wish to emigrate, obviously, to the United States or just connect with their families who live in the United States. It's affecting Muslims who are going to witness a doubling down on a war on terror paradigm that has made them insecure in their own homes abroad. And it's going to affect Muslim communities in the West more broadly because it's connecting to a kind of nativist politics that we've seen growing as a trend amongst US-aligned countries and beyond. So when you see Putin and the Russian Duma, when you see the Hungarian electoral authoritarian president, and so on, celebrating this, when you see Marine Le Pen in France saying that this portends her own victory in the French presidential elections, all of this makes up a broader international narrative. And that international narrative also points us to the direction of how we might expect a Trump presidency look in the medium term. Beyond the campaign platform, we can expect a politics of governing by identifying internal enemies and governing through invoking external threats to maintain the consolidated constituency that he has mobilized in this election. All of that represents a kind of threat that I think we need to understand in local, national, regional, and international terms for Muslims and for all of us.
So I think one of the most chilling things, two of the most chilling things are the fact that this is happening at the worst possible time. When the existing checks, however mild they might have been, are truly not in place like they might have been in some earlier period of time, and that this is part of a global, as you said, global arc that we're seeing everywhere, and this being a domino effect across the globe. So, truly chilling information. I want to come back shortly and just get a sense of what everybody thinks we can expect and look towards internationalizing our struggle. And just getting a few basics on the table before I go back to Hiroshi. Ezra, what can you tell us about the Trump-Pence track record on LGBTQI+ rights, and what can we expect from this administration?
Yes, thank you, Kim. Honestly, the biggest problem right now is there's a great degree of uncertainty. Mike Pence is a very strong and lengthy track record of being abhorrently anti-LGBT. Famously, as the governor of Indiana, he pushed for a religious freedom law that essentially would embolden private businesses to openly discriminate against LGBT people, though that was fought and battled back down by immense pressure from the federal government as well as the community and corporate allies. The greatest fear is now with this shift in power that we will no longer have the kinds of strong coalitions that we needed in the past to push back on those sort of policy pushes. Obviously, most people on the call today are probably aware over the last year there has been a strong push throughout the country to limit the rights of transgender people, likely as backlash to marriage equality. So targeting the most vulnerable members of the LGBT community for exclusion from schools, from the workplace, from federal government, from state buildings if you're in North Carolina or in other places. And we're likely to see more emboldened efforts to continue to attack transgender people and other folks. We're also likely to see a vacuum in power and progress in the LGBT community. For the last 8 years, we have had the benefit of having the Obama administration have our back in the courts, in Congress to the extent they could, and through robust executive power. One of the biggest things that Mike Pence and Donald Trump have been on the record saying that they will do within their first 100 days is to roll back a series of executive orders. Though those orders cover a range of subjects, the vast majority of them were executive orders that allowed federal workers, federal contractors, which cover a great deal of workers in the United States, as well as others, to live openly in the workplace, to have redress within the federal grievance system if they experience discrimination, and likely that is all to go away. We are also likely to see a repeal or at least significant modification of the Affordable Care Act, a key mechanism through which many poor people in the LGBT community were able to access health insurance for the first time, and the vast majority of transgender Americans were able to use as a tool to fight back against discrimination when their private as well as public health insurers denied access to life-saving transition health care. We're also afraid there will be a degree of court packing. Obviously, all constituent communities will be affected by that, but more so than other communities, LGBT Americans are at the mercy of the federal courts. Many state courts are hostile towards us and to our rights. For the last 8 years, we've proceeded, and I've proceeded as a litigator with many of my clients through federal litigation, federal courts, knowing that we were safe in those spaces. That is no longer an assumption that we can operate under. We are going to have to change our litigation strategies. We're going to have to change the ways we fight back against this politics of hate that will now be emboldened by the power of the federal government. Lastly, we're deeply, deeply afraid. There's an article, I believe, in the New Yorker, which I shared with a few of the speakers today, called "The Intersectional Hatred of Donald Trump." Deeply afraid of the extent to which Trump's politics of hatred has seemingly grabbed up every vulnerable minority group in the United States, and he has hit across so many lines of deeply entrenched hatred towards vulnerable groups that it is hard at times to track who exactly he hates on any given day. And people seem to the extent that he is inconsistent in his hatred and inconsistent in his politics, not see the grander project at play, that it is not just an assault on women, it is not just an assault on Blacks, it is not just an assault on gays and transgender people, immigrants and Muslims, it is an assault constantly on all of us.
Thank you, Ezra. So, yeah, interesting how how Trumpism is able to use intersectionality to their benefit. Before we move to broader conversation, I want to come back to Hiroshi. You know, it looks grim, and it is, but of course, it's not hopeless as long as we have some sense of what's possible for us to do collectively. So, help us start this process of thinking about what can happen next by giving us a sense of what opposition to the administration's immigration policy could look like.
Well, I can start to answer the question by thinking about what has been done by way of opposition in other episodes. And the most recent ones that I've been involved in have to do with what happened after the Bill Clinton period in the mid-1990s, 1996 legislation I mentioned earlier, and also the post-9/11 period that also mentioned earlier, and immigrants' rights. What do we learn from that? What has happened? What mistakes were made? And what did we learn? And what succeeded? And there are many different pieces of this. I'm sure I'll leave something out, but let me just mention some of the most important ones. You know, obviously, working closely with communities. Right now, there's this tremendous need for information for individuals and families who they may have documented family members. They may have people who are undocumented and fear deportation. There's so much that can be done, and that's a side both of reassurance and community building. Clearly, the mobilizing the grassroots here, the building coalitions, including coalitions that may be that maybe not be the ones that that we're used to or most comfortable with, including, for example, I think looking back to the fact that to a significant extent before the year 2000, before the year 2004, we had immigration was much more, and immigrants' rights was much more of a bipartisan issue. I think there are people in the Republican Party who are very concerned about what Trump may do. Then, of course, one of the things we learned in the mid-2000s especially is the effectiveness of public forms of resistance and demonstrations and civil disobedience that ultimately led, in many ways, to DACA. I think one thing to keep in mind is the importance of state and local communities, and in particular state and local governments, and I would include universities in that. This is where facts and are made, and this is ultimately where resistance is formed, and not just resistance on the ground and in the streets, but also the starting of the building of public opinion and outrage. I can't. One of the reasons I made the comment about exactly what is Trump going to follow through on this pledge to revoke DACA or immediately is because we do have 800,000 people out there, and what's going to happen if that becomes very public, his efforts against them. I think that litigation has been key. It was key in Proposition 187's case in 1994. It's been key and ongoing ever since the 96 Act. Certainly did a lot of good on SB 1070. I think it's important that it be grounded in community concerns. I think one of the things that the DACA reflects is that there's a point at which litigation and professional lobbying only go so far, but litigation is really important. And I also think that it's important, this is more of a personal note, but I think each of us needs to think about doing well what we know we can do well. We need to get better, each of us individually, the things we don't know how to do as well as we might, and I think we need to take care of ourselves and trust and work with others.
And you put your finger on doing what we do well, better, and knowing what we don't do well, and learning. So there is a part of this that is about building cross-issue literacy, learning how these issues impact constituencies that we might not perceive as immediately our own, or we don't see those within our constituencies who are facing precisely these issues. So one of the ways that we can think intersectionally across all these issue areas. Thank you very much, Hiroshi, for your time this morning. Asma, let me go to you. You've laid out, again, a sobering picture of how this is in concert with what is happening globally. You know, one of the mantras of our movement is think globally, act locally. What do we do with that now in this moment? And how should we be thinking and moving, given the picture that you described for us?
So I think there are some things that we can learn from that picture. There is a playbook that's emerged pretty much globally, and Donald Trump seems to have drawn on it heavily, perhaps unwittingly. But you see a common pattern. You see, for example, contempt for an independent judiciary, and we saw that in spades during this campaign, calling into question federal judges on the basis of their ethnicity. You see contempt for independent media and the suggestion that media needs to be shut down or filtered in some way. And again, that was evident in spades here. You see, as I've already suggested, an identification of internal enemies, and that's completely consistent with the accounts we've heard across the board on this call of the ways that you really can't count all the different communities that have been named and reviled in this campaign. And we've seen in the election results the presence of a significant urban-rural divide in this country, which again is something that has been deployed effectively as a mobilization strategy to bring out voters for the tactics that we've seen across all the countries that I'm thinking of, the Russias and Hungaries, the Philippines and Turkeys, the Indias and Israels. I mean, these are countries that are electoral democracies, but they're functioning at the moment as a kind of bare majoritarian politics in which if you can get 50.0001% of those who choose to come out to the polls to vote in your favor, you can continually build what effectively has amounted to a durable electoral majority for each of those effectively authoritarian leaders and electoral democracies. That's what I think we face, that possibility. Now, let's recall that only 50% of the eligible electorate chose to vote, and of them, only half or less than half voted for Donald Trump. So first, we need to ask ourselves, how do we effectively mobilize the other 75%? And then we have to ask, what's the strategy that's being used to demobilize that group and to ensure that the 25% that will come out for Trump will continue to come out in 2 years, in 4 years, in 6 years, in 8 years? And I think the answer to that is politics of polarization. The truth is, everything that hurt us about this campaign helped Trump. It mobilized the constituency and built it and gave him an electoral dividend. And that's exactly what we've seen worldwide. That's what caused people like Marine Le Pen to celebrate, because she believes the same strategy is going to now help her in France. How can we address that strategy? Well, we need to look at where is it working? And that urban-rural divide is a starting point for us to think about how to undercut what we've just seen in terms of, you don't even need a ground operation if you can tap into people's fear, identify an internal enemy with whom they believe they can build a coalition, and they will then enable them to, for whatever it is that's driving their fear, their disenfranchisement nation. And this pattern I described in our script was emerged most powerfully as a result of the France recession. This country. There's no doubt about that. All of the other analyses are right.
Great. We lost your tail end, but we certainly heard where you were going, Asla. And I wanted to just put a pin in what you were saying about everything that hurt us helped him, and link that to Devin's earlier comment, it wasn't me. So one of the challenges that we have is being able to mobilize a national conversation against those forces that would want us to repress and not acknowledge how the politics of fear have basically created the possibility for victory without necessarily effective ground game. So one is the need to push back with the normalization. And then second would be the question of, so what is the most important tactic for us now? Is it to mobilize that 25%, that 50% of the 50% that would likely vote to push back on this, or to engage in a politics of, I guess, denial, post-Trumpism, post-racism, post-xenophobia, all of the ways in which the move after the last election was not to confront what was happening, and instead act as if this was a democratic exercise that was not shaped by all of these problems. So I want to let that hang for a moment and perhaps come back and get folks' thoughts about that, but ask Ezra to talk to us about what are the possible pushbacks that we can imagine in order to defend against the anti-LGBTQ plus communities.
Sure, thank you, Kim. I think we'll very much need a two-prong approach. We'll most definitely need to take meaningful steps to protect the gains we were able to make under the Obama administration. For all intents and purposes, marriage equality is likely very safe. It was, for a long time, the defining goal in our movement. We need to move beyond that now. We need to look at who is most vulnerable in our communities right now. It's LGBT workers across the country, especially in red states without state level and local protections, ensuring that there's not discrimination in the workplace and meaningful redress. It's LGBT people throughout the country, especially in states that formerly fell under preclearance under the Voter Rights Act, who are unable to exercise their ability at the polls to push back against Trumpism if we do not fill that gap. We also need to think thoughtfully and meaningfully about building stronger coalitions across movements, as we are all, as we can all see from the pictures and from what we've seen so far, under attack now. For a long time, again, the LGBT community under the Obama administration was operating under the assumption that when we went to court, when we went to Congress, we would have support from the government. We are no longer going to have that support. We need to make sure that when impact cases are filed, we have immigrants' rights advocates, prison abolitionist advocates, people, all throughout the progressive communities supporting each other in our litigation. We also need to make sure that we do not forget the moment that we are living in now. I know right now we're talking a lot about how we get ourselves to the next election cycle, but I think we have all learned a very, very hard lesson that this isn't about just trying to fight the current evil, the current zeitgeist. This is about trying to anticipate it ahead of time and make sure that we do not allow this to happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. So I'm going to just put a quick question to folks who are on the line so far to ponder while I pitch back to Cynthia to just get a few of the tweets. So on the question of strategy, one can think of, we become more blue, we mobilize, we reach out, we build strength where we have not tapped effectively in our own constituencies, or we become purple. We try to figure out ways of reaching over without necessarily disrupting the baseline assumptions about how to talk about politics these days, namely suppressing these isms and figuring out how to build common cause with folks who have responded to Trumpism. And I'm putting them somewhat as intentionally opposite possibilities just to sort of get a temperature on how people are thinking about that. So as you ponder that, I'm going to ask Cynthia to just give us a couple of tweets and we'll get back to our conversation. Coming up will be Robin Kelly, Alicia Garza, Eve Ensler, and Sherelle Brown. Cynthia.
Thanks, Kim. So this time around, we've got some great comments on moving forward in our next steps. Liam at Liam Dempsey says, I'm taking a step to reduce my own ignorance. The AA Policy Forum webinar is my first small step. Thank you, Liam, and we hope you can help guide others towards taking more steps. We've got Carmen at Carmen Shorter DC who says, you must break the soil to plant the seed. The seed breaks the soil to bring forth a new life. Disruption precedes freedom. And these are motivational words to keep in mind as we enter this disruptive period. And finally, we've got Fatou GW at FGWAGGEH. America needs an intergroup dialogue on race, gender, religion, sexuality, nationality, all the isms, now more than ever. And we absolutely agree, and we invite everyone here today to continue this dialogue and ask others to join us. Thank you to everyone who's chimed in so far. Please keep sharing with us your next steps and thoughts. And back to you, Kim.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. So I want to thank our panelists who have spoken so far and urge continuous engagement with these ideas. Keep tweeting and send us your questions. So I put on the table, more blue, do we move in a purple direction? Hold on to that because we're now moving into the conversation about what we do now. So I want to begin with Robin Kelly to, first of all, get a long view about where we are now as we think about moving forward. What is it that we have missed, or perhaps our contemporary political discourse among social justice advocates? What do we need to understand where we are historically? Have we been in a place like this before? Are there elements of this that feel like the end of the first Reconstruction? Are there lessons that you think that we need to pull forward in thinking through what now?
Yeah, well, here's a short version of a very long, long answer, and that is, I mean, we could begin simply with the Electoral College, which itself, there's been a lot of talk about the Electoral College as a relic of the founders' elitism. But we also have to remember that it's primarily a relic of slavery, that the politics of slavery produced that institution, that the 3/5 clause was applied to the Electoral College, and that, in fact, even the election of 1800 really centered around slave states having more power than non-slave states. And the myth, and the one that we're still carrying now, which is why the system's so arcane, is that states with smaller populations somehow need to be at the table in an equitable way with those with large populations. When in fact, it wasn't about populations, it was about slaves. It's about those states that have slaves that they count 3 out of 5 for congressional representation. And that's why the South dominated the presidency for so long. At the end of slavery, of course, you get Reconstruction, and one of the most famous cases of electoral college deciding or not really deciding an election was the famous Hayes-Tilden Compromise from the 1876 elections. Without going into that story, it's very simple. You have a case of, once again, suppressed Black votes, which were not counted, and rather than try to count them, the Republicans and Democrats kind of came to an agreement where the Republican got the presidency in exchange for withdrawing troops from the South. And that sort of reminds us that, you know, there's the problems of the electoral college, the problems of the electoral system go hand in hand with vote suppression. And as we think about this past election, we do have to pay attention to the way that the gutting of the Voting Rights Act played a role. One last thing, finally, you know, so people talk about this as a story of disaffected voters, of angry white men who supposedly were suffering economically and feel forgotten, and that Trump's populist message represented sort of the nation's distrust of Washington, or the inside the Beltway, Washington. And the problem is that, you know, there's a way in which race and class are treated separately rather than intersectionally, you know, and so the way in which this white middle and working class sees their disaffection is through in racial terms, which is why in the polls they'll say, look, immigration and terrorism are more important than jobs. Both of those categories, immigration and terrorism, are racial categories in some ways in terms of who's the enemy, because no one is talking about eliminating the Klan or eliminating the alt-right or eliminating a rise of white terrorism, which is a real issue in our country, as if that's not really the terrorism we're talking about. In fact, if anything, we see the legitimacy of white terrorism and white racism on a very high scale. So, you know, you know, given that history and given the fact that in every single instance, and this is the final thing I want to say about this, every single instance of biracial or multiracial coalition building in our history, it's usually been led by people of color, led by Black people, with white people following, and that often results or ends badly. It ends badly only because many of the whites who join such multiracial, interracial coalitions don't necessarily have, they're dealing with an immediate problem, whether the problem is wages or union recognition, or, you know, whereas some of those who have led those movements, like populist movements and Reconstruction, have actually wanted to change the country, change the culture, do something much more visionary than, say, solve an immediate problem. In other words, it's not utilitarian. And so one of the things we have to think about as we move into the future is that if we're going to build, you know, multiracial coalitions, you know, we don't need to reach out to disaffected white men in order to sell them on how this benefits them. People have to be willing to envision a different future, a different country, take a much more radical step, because otherwise we're going to be back in the same place over and over again.
So thank you, Robin. I take that as a push for not a move to purple, but a move to
not a move.
Blue, right? Thank you.
Right.
And, you know, you raised
red,
so much.
But the other red.
The other true red, right. So, you know, one of the points that you made, and I was hoping we would hear from the amazing Barbara Arnwine on the vote suppression issue. There's so much that happened and so little coverage on it, even leading up to the election. So what's your sense of what was behind the media's refusal to take seriously the impact of vote suppression? And we could go all the way back to the Gore election, much more of a focus on the hanging chads, and no focus whatsoever on the hundreds of thousands of votes that would have made the difference that were suppressed from a direct targeted campaign. Robin?
Oh, that's for me. Oh, okay. I thought you were.
Yeah.
Okay, right. Yeah. So, well, you know, I was totally thought you were asking someone else that question. So
No, that's
I was
okay.
sort of like waiting for the answer. No.
Hey, Kim, can you hear me? Can you hear me, Kim? No, they can't hear me. I should hang up if you can't hear me.
Yeah, I can hear. Well, I was going to say
we can hear you, but go ahead, Robin, and Mary Frances, I'll come to you in a minute.
Yeah, very quickly. I mean, one of the things, this may not be a direct answer, but sort of an indirect answer, is that we do have some lessons we can learn from the recent, not just the 2000 election, which is the one we always refer to, but even if you think about the election of Ronald Reagan and what that election meant, because in some ways it's very similar. He was a candidate that no one really took that seriously. People were shocked by his election in some respects, and he very much mobilized around a white anti-tax, anti-immigrant, anti-black movement. And it also coincides with the period in the 1980s where there were all these, and I know Mary Frances Berry was there, looking at these things, all these investigations into not just vote suppression, but violent suppression of Black political constituencies in the South. There's a long, consistent history of this, and to pay attention to not just the ability to get people mobilized to vote, but the recognition that at least among those who are most oppressed, we have the highest percentage of participation in voting, and that something like waiting in line for 8 or 10 hours or 6 hours or 3 hours is a form of vote suppression. So I can't imagine any time. Yes. Right. Yeah. It's vote suppression. So we have a kind of consistent history post 1965, let alone before that, of the continued vote suppression which shaped elections.
Thank you. So I want to go to Mary Frances very quickly. We've got Alicia Garza, Sherelle Brown, Eve Ensler talking next. So Mary Frances, please, quickly on vote suppression.
I'll be very fast because after this I have to get off. So I got this to say. One is that the reason why people didn't pay much attention to the voter suppression and all those people who didn't get to vote, which we call the no count. I did hearings on it. They were broadcast internationally. Is because we got a law passed, which didn't do much good. Is because Albert Gore Jr. refused to fight on the basis of what was found and simply did what somebody else here called normalizing the situation by just giving in. But the only other thing I wanted to say while I'm on is that, yes, we should not normalize, but yes, we need a two-pronged strategy. Protest is an essential ingredient of politics. So we need to continue protesting all the bad things that we hate that Trump is talking about doing, bigotry, police violence, and I'm so happy Alicia is on here, and the other issues. We need to do that and do it across racial lines and do it with that 43% or whatever there was of white women who didn't vote for Trump, and do it with the Muslim community, the Latinos, and everybody else. And we also need to, while we're protesting, and just continue to protest unrelentingly when he does stuff and against the possibility and the people he's nominating to hold these jobs in Washington, which if you're not inside politics, you don't understand that that's where the policy is made when these people get control of these agencies. And then we need also, though, to figure out the things that Trump said he was going to do that we want done, like jobs. Not that he's going to do it. Anything he said, child care, whatever, and demand that he do it. And then when he doesn't do it, and if he doesn't, then protest that. So you need to do both things. It's not either or, it's both and. That's all I have to say.
All right. Thank you, Mary Frances Berry. And Alicia Garza, we've just heard Mary Frances shout you out, so let's go to you. We are now beginning to hear what our primary task should be at this moment, given this terrain. So start us off on that. What is it that you see at this moment for our movement?
Well, I think Mary Frances kicked it off quite well, so I'm just going to build on some of the things that she just said, which is absolutely correct. So the first thing that I think should be clear to all of us is that our primary task as people who are not only disaffected by the recent shift in the political terrain, but also have a clear vision for what kind of world we want to live in, then the primary task is for us to build a broad-based movement against fascism that is multi-class, multi-gender, multiracial, and multinational. And I'm going to break that down a little bit. So I think that one of the things that is scaring me in this moment is that I'm starting to see the left as a broad kind of swath move back into some pretty dangerous tendencies. So one dangerous tendency is to assume that because we are terrified, anxious, fearful, and scared, quite frankly, of what the potential of this kind of not just administration, but political terrain means for our communities right now and in the intermediate term and in the long term, there's a tendency that we then have to go back into our silos. So we are under attack. My particular group is under attack. I don't have time to think about what your group is dealing with. I just need to fight like hell to save my own people. And that is the worst possible thing that we could be doing right now. There is no better time than now for us to really figure out how to work intersectional politics in practice. And with that, we also need to make sure that we are not just talking to people who already agree with us, but that we are reaching out to folks who, quite frankly, I mean, the comments earlier about people saying, well, I'm confused about what is the Black Lives Matter movement? I'm upset about why people care about why trans people should be able to use bathrooms. We need to do a better job of reaching out to those folks and making sure that our vision also is a vision for them. And that is different from capitulating to the worst tendencies of this moment. Under no circumstance should we normalize, capitulate, negotiate with, compromise with any vision that that removes humanity from anybody. And we need to be really careful about that, because I do think that there's a failed strategy, right, that people call, playing for the center, but what they actually mean is camouflaging themselves as part of the right, and they're very different things. The other thing that I think we can't underestimate, I mean, when you look at those maps, it is very clear what we need to be doing. And to me, I think one thing we've got to be really, really clear and strong on is that there is nothing at all that replaces grassroots organizing. Absolutely nothing at all. And I think it's important for us to continue to think about how do we use technology-based tools to reach more people, but it is not a substitute for having real conversations with folks in real plain language, right? That really puts out not only what's at stake, which we're really good at. We are really good at sounding the alarm and being like, we're about to run over a cliff, but we're not that great yet, and we need to get much better about being able to talk about what's on the other side and really paint that picture in a way that people can taste, touch, feel, and smell. Another thing that I think is really important here is to do both. So as Mary Frances said, absolutely 100% active opposition to all of the reactionary policies and practices that are moving in real time right now. But that deep organizing piece, I think we also need to make sure that we are locating that appropriately in the Midwest and in the South, and being led by folk who have been doing that organizing, isolated from the rest of the country, and quite frankly, overshadowed by the visions and the strategies that are coming from people on the coast. We all have something to contribute, but I think if we're going to get real about what strategies will work to change what that map looks like, it absolutely needs to be led by folk who have been treading water in this landscape for a long time before the rest of us started to really feel it, touch it, taste it, etc. And then there's just a concrete thing that I think is really important that I'll close with, is that this is a time for us to protect and provide for each other. There's something to be said that is very real about Trump's 100-day agenda, which includes repealing and rolling back the Affordable Care Act, which includes things like, you know, he says for every, you know, new federal regulation, we have to get rid of 2 other ones. You know, these are things that will impact people's lives right now, and we need to be able to have a way to take care of folks. So how do we get people medicine that will not have access to it? I mean, there are already tons of people who don't get to access the Affordable Care Act or get to access Medicaid because their Republican governors wouldn't accept federal money to expand that program so that more people could access it. But it's very, very real that with the Republican control of the House, the Senate, and the presidency, as well as the ability to appoint federal judges and Supreme Court judges, there will be a move to limit people's access to basic needs, not just at the federal level, but at the state and local level. And so we've got to get real sharp about figuring out how it is that we provide for our folks and how we defend each other against attacks. The things that we're reading about, that we're hearing about, stories of people being punched in the face who are wearing hijab, stories of people being told you're going to get deported soon because we won, is a real thing. And I think I'm not clear that we're sure about what it means to actually physically protect people who are in danger. And so that's a piece of what we can do and think about right now that needs to be put into place. And one suggestion that I would have, just in closing, is that we talk to people who've been defending folks for a long time. The folks that come to mind, right, are folks who have been protecting people's right to access healthcare services, right? Those folks know exactly what it means to go up against racist vigilantes. They know exactly what it means to protect people with the least amount of loss of life, right? And so those are some strategies that we could be employing right now to make sure that our communities are safe and are inspired, right, to join the fight, that they're not so paralyzed by fear or, quite frankly, so decimated by not having access to the things that they need that they're not able to be a part of this movement. So I'll close that there.
Thank you, Alicia, for bringing us back and reminding us of just the basic sensory dimensions of human life that can lead us and help us capture what needs to be done and where to receive leadership and guidance. And on that note, I think we're now joined by Dallas Goldtooth. Dallas, are you on?
Yeah, I'm on.
Great. So what can you share from what's happening now, particularly in Standing Rock? How do we think about the need to mobilize from the ground up white supremacy in the context of what, after all, is a reality of settler colonialism? So take us through your vision of where we go from here.
I appreciate the opportunity, Kimberly, and I actually appreciate the voices and the words that have been expressed. And Alicia, I really appreciated not just offering, being able to also offer the tactics that are necessary for us to move ahead. I think that understanding of deep organizing and supporting the grassroots level and supporting the grassroots voices, not only for the voice in their opinion of what they're fighting against, but also uplifting their voices of what they're fighting for. And I think that that's a critical dialogue that is always necessary for us to move ahead. Right now, what we're facing in North Dakota and the fight against Dakota Access Pipeline is just a mere continuation of 500 years of colonialism and white supremacy. That's just point blank. And the visuals that we are facing off against, this overtly militarized law enforcement who are dictating who has access to what is traditionally a native land, is no different than what our ancestors faced off with over 150 years ago. It's just painful to see that in the modern context. With the recent election stuff, it's, we are not I guess we are disappointed, yes, but surprised, not in the least. I mean, I think that as Indigenous communities, we are not just, we have a special relationship within the context of this hegemonic system, this colonial system, because we're not just ethnic minorities, but are political entities unto ourselves as tribal nations. And so for us, it's a critical moment for us to exert our inherent sovereignty and our ability to self-determine the future of our communities, but then also to connect that with other struggles from other communities who are basically in the same boat of self-determining for themselves what happens to their water, their land, their bodies, to their homes, to their food, and really building it from that support base. And I think that a lot of relatives, whether they're from in the middle of Detroit, or they're in Oakland, or they're out in the deserts of New Mexico and Arizona, really look to the leadership of the Indigenous land-based struggle as a kind of a foundational, as a solid foundation for us to move ahead. Because I think that no matter what, we have to rethink our relationship, not only to each other, but at the very core of it, rethink our relationship to the land itself and to Mother Earth. I think that as long as we keep to this conversation about how we're trying to heal the relationship between our communities or our relationship to our oppressor, without having a conversation about how we're healing this relationship to the land itself and to the water, then we're ultimately going to fail. I think that it's all a critical part of a holistic approach to bringing healing to each and every one of us.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Dallas. And of course, that conversation opens up into the entire debate about climate change, which of course we have to include in the agenda that has been established by Trumpism as well. So keeping that as part of this conversation is opened up by you, Dallas, and Alicia. So moving on with what this moment suggests for us, for our movements, for our vision, for our aspirations. I want to go to Eve Ensler. Eve, what are you seeing? What does this time require us to set our intention for and to do?
Thank you, Kim, and I want to thank AFP for organizing this really critical call, and everyone who's spoken so brilliantly, and everyone who's listening. A lot of what I'm going to say may be repetitive because Alicia, I said a lot of what I wanted to say, but I think, first of all, we have to have a lot more webinars and calls and teach-ins like this and on the grassroots level. I think dialogue right now is critical, education, analysis, really confronting the truth of where we are and listening to a cross-section of ideas and people on the ground who will input into a vision of where we're going. I think teach-ins, educational forums, I think we need to build multiracial visions. And I want to pick up on something that Robin was saying. I think this is a moment to really go for a much bigger radical vision and really looking at neoliberal capitalism in general as a system that we want to deconstruct. And saying, okay, here we are. What is the world we want to build and what does that world look like? I think we have to really have each other's backs. We know that Trump is in the process of building his enemies list, and we have to be tight in our support of each other. I think in some ways we have to work on two fronts, resisting and protesting right now and protecting with actions and strategies those who are under immediate threat. Standing Rock, immigrants, Muslims, Mexicans, women, LGBTQ, African American, communities of privilege have to reach out and really be protective of communities that don't have those protections. And I think we have to really look at climate change. It is the most looming threat on the planet right now. Every scientist is telling us that we have 5 years to change our extraction policies, and we have to push forward on that. We cannot let that linger behind, and it has to be upfront in what we're doing. I think really there's a two-pronged approach, resisting, protesting right now, and then having a longer view where we begin to weave a broader and deeper intersectional, progressive, anti-neoliberal capitalist, anti-racist, misogynist, pro-people, immigrant, refugee movement. And I want to pick up on something Alicia said. I so agree with her. about how fear gets us to lock down and cut out into our own silos, and fight for our own terrain. And this is the moment, the exact opposite of that. That's why it requires deep thinking, analysis, and time so that we intersect our movements and fight for each other, with each other. And I think that is one of the most critical things we can think about. I also want to say that it's critical we link our movements to global movements. We are not in this alone. As someone earlier on the call talked about the authoritarian, xenophobic regimes that are rising in India, in France, in Russia, in Congo, in Hungary, in Croatia, Brexit. We have to see that we are part of a global anti-neoliberal capitalist, anti-racist, anti-xenophobic movement across the planet. And today, in a statement put out by the Gabrielle movement, they are looking at a worsening time of escalating imperialism, which they're terrified of, seeing how capitalism and war and famine are escalating. And I'm getting calls from my sisters across the planet urging us to join arms in struggle with people across the planet. And I think really the last thing, one of the lessons I want to say is we have to build coalitions that go beyond a two-party system and really promote and create a vision, an idea of what we want, and then begin to create the mechanisms and the levers and the strategies to bring that about. I think it's clear that the salt is on all of us, and this could actually be the time to unify all of us.
Thank you, Eve. And so on that note about what we currently are facing, the need for international consciousness among the many things we want to reach out to, I want to call in Sherelle Brown and pose it to you, Sherelle, in a couple different ways. So what are some of the strategic points of disruption, particularly for millennial activists? And then more broadly, how do we connect this more concretely? We know we need to do work in consciousness raising and solidarity building in an international frame. What are the implications of this moment, this Trump presidency, for how we do that, where we do that, what capacity do we need to do that? So Sherelle.
Thank you, Kim, and thanks everyone who is on the call and listening. I so appreciate existing in a world where you all are doing magical, brilliant, dope work. The thing about going at the tail end of these things is so many other brilliant answers have been given. So I'm going to be brief and try to touch on points that I haven't heard already. First, I want to say that earlier on in the conversation discussion, we talked a lot about white women and their overwhelming support of Trump. And I think one of the things that I haven't heard offered yet is that I think that white women voted for him the same reason why so many decided to re-elect Bush for his second term after 9/11. And that was because of fear. This fear against the unknown, against looters and rioters, against BLM protesters, and sort of in support of course, Blue Lives Matter, right? And so a large part of what we have to do now, what I think Alicia spoke to and what Robert spoke to, is doing this visioning work, imagining a world where safety is something else outside of militarized police and borders erected out of xenophobia and tough brass knuckled leaders, right? So I think it's important to name that because we now have this white nationalist demagogue in office for the next 4 years, who has both a majority in the House and the Senate. And the last time this happened, we were in a recession, and then before that, a depression. And there lies, and I think, a meaningful point of intervention for activists and the millennials, especially those who haven't yet fully been activated, but understand that they can no longer opt out. We have a number of important local races coming up. In 2018, there are, I think, 435 seats in the House, I think 33 seats in the Senate, and about 38 governorships. And in 2008, after Obama won his first election, we saw the GOP pour every ounce of energy and resources into these local elections, resulting in this sort of red washing that happened in 2010. also, when we talk about these GOP, the efforts, I think it's important to acknowledge that we can't talk about voter apathy without talking about the prison industrial complex system and how our carceral state disenfranchises folks from participating. So I think we have to really struggle with this idea around just talking simply about electoral organizing and getting out the vote, without talking about the systems in place that disenfranchise entire populations from participating fully. I think it's also important to name that with the divide of white women between Trump and Hillary, that Black women right now aren't only the soul and the future of the Democratic Party, but they're really what's going to save this country from itself. So I think it's important to remember that, right, and to invest into Black women and Black leadership. Now, to the international piece, there's been a lot of comparisons between Trump's election and the sort of ethnic nationalism that allowed Brexit to happen. And I think it's important to remember that these global events don't happen in a vacuum. Trump won harping on the same white nativist ideals that made space for Brexit to happen, right? And so we have to think through now, how do we build a multiracial, multi-class alliance across national borders? I think a part of that is getting really uncomfortable with ourselves and really naming the ways in which we ourselves are implicit in reifying pillars of white supremacy. So being really rigorous in our critiques around not only race, but also imperialism and classism and capitalism. I think that's the only way that we get free. And I do want to end this on a happy note, right? I think that the reason why this is happening is because we are winning. And sorry, I'm getting this notification that I left the meeting. I thought I was going. And I just want to name that white supremacy has its way of reorganizing itself historically every couple of years. And so what we're seeing now is a mobilization, a response to the movement for Black lives and the great work that we're already doing. And so how we respond now is our next shot. I think it's important to organize. And we hear this word organizing being used a lot by elected officials and politicians, and not to create this hierarchy, but I think organizing demands a certain level of skill that we have to be really intentional about. It's about that mobilization that Alicia talked about earlier. It's about that door knocking and those knee-to-knee conversations. I'm from North Carolina, where the KKK are rallying right now over this victory of Trump. And so I think it's important that we not only look at the South and the Midwest when it comes to election time, when we think about swing states, but it's important to invest resources in areas that aren't usually sexy to fund, outside of our New York or our California or our DC.
Thank you, Sherelle. So we have just a little bit of time left to throw out some of the questions, that invite any of the panelists who want to amplify, build on, or respond to what they've heard. I'm going to just throw out some of the questions that we've heard thus far, so folks can take a few minutes to think about it. Then we'll hear from Cynthia real quickly, just about some of the tweets that have come since we've been talking. There's several questions. People want to know some specific threats that are in the horizon for some of the groups that we haven't yet discussed, the disability community, children, those who are facing incarceration. So if there are some notes about what's happening there and how we can be responsive, folks want to know about that. Folks want to know about what we should be saying to our children right now. Many folks have had the difficulty of waking up Wednesday and Thursday morning and trying to figure out what to say to our children. Who has ideas about which way we should be going? How do we equip our children? How do we protect them? And then people want to know, what should we be doing before January 21st to prepare? There are some ideas on the table. Do we have a sense of whether this is a moment to move quickly, to mobilize? This is a moment to think hard about how to mobilize. What does advocacy look like? What is it that we think that we should do? And lastly, folks want to have a sense about what to do now that most the government is now largely controlled by those who deeply disagree with our agenda. Is there any point in history that we can draw from in which we've been put in a similar situation? And some want to know, are there other countries, other places where we can see effective intersectional advocacies taking strategic advances that we can draw upon? So as I asked our panelists to think about some of those questions, they prepare a closing quick remark. I'm going to go to Cynthia. Quickly, what have we been hearing, Cynthia?
Hi, Kim. We've been hearing a lot of great stuff. I'm continuously blown away by just how thoughtful and inspiring our commentators have been. So here are a few wrap-up thoughts from our listeners. And it looks like the theme of the day is about inclusion and protection. From Lucas Osborne at Luke T. Osborne, we've got, this election was just as much about white identity politics as economics. Need to build an inclusive future for all. And Jamila Jones reminds us that at this time, it's more important than ever that we got to protect people right now. And finally, from Mimi Wallace, we've got the suggestion that we should use personal resources and strategies that promote protection and intervention. Let's keep this conversation going, and hopefully our panelists can have some suggestions for us on what people can do as individuals.
Okay, thanks, Cynthia. So starting from the top of the hour and just moving quickly through our panelists who are still with us. Tim, any thoughts in response to the questions, or benediction, as it were? Where do we go from here? Yes. Okay, Tim. I thought I saw you.
Yeah. Repeat the question one more time. I was in the middle of writing.
So, Tim, just closing thoughts or responses to some of the questions that folks have laid out. People are looking for direction, guidance, strategy, hope, thoughts, things that they need to know.
Well, I think that almost, everything I would have said has been said, and I think a lot of the strategic ideas that were put out by several folks are exactly what I would have repeated. Let me speak to the children piece. I can say something about that. My kids, of course, are 15 and 13 and very knowledgeable about what's going on. They obviously know the work that I do. They were distraught, but what I told them, a couple of things. Number one, this is why we fight. I mean, it's very similar to what I told my children when George Zimmerman was acquitted and, had to explain sort of welcome to your country, right? Don't be under any illusion that you live in the country that you're told about by others. You live in this one, and this is why we fight. But the second thing, I think it's really important to tell kids, particularly maybe younger than my kids, who maybe aren't as easily processing what's going on, right? Is that you cannot allow, in spite of the fear, in spite of the real anxiety, all of which is very legitimate, you can't allow this man and this movement of his to steal the joy of your childhood. It's very important to remember that this is a man who's not worthy of your he certainly earned your fear and your anxiety, but he's not worthy of stealing from you not only the joy of your childhood, but the commitment that even a child can make to creating a different world. And so I think this is a taxing moment for our children, particularly for children of color, particularly for Muslim children, particularly for those who are going to be targeted. Obviously, for my girls, it's a bit different, but as women, certainly they have to be hyper aware of what this means for them. And I think we just tell them this is why we fight. It's why we redouble our commitment, and we're going to find joy and we're going to find strength in resistance. And so I think that's what we have to tell them.
Thank you so much, Tim. Thank you for joining us. Devin, are you still with us?
I am.
So what parting words do you have for us?
So I think I have just two quick sets of comments. One with respect to engaging our children. I think I would make absolutely clear that American democracy is imperfect. It is flawed. And we have to remember that our systems of inequality have not been oppositional to American democracy. our systems of equality have been expressed through American democracy. So there's something both new and not new about this particular moment. If we understand that and they understand that, then it helps recognize that we've always been in the struggle of resistance against a project that is always already a work in progress. And I think we need to emphasize the extent to which they themselves are agents of change, and they themselves can make communities through which change happens. So it's not us that are the ones who are going to push the needle for them. It's them that are going to push it for themselves and help us think about how we might do so as well. And the final thing I want to say is that as we think about all of this, that we not lose sight of the role of law and legal institutions. And I want to emphasize that precisely because progressives sometimes poo-poo law as if the real politics is somehow outside of law, not taking seriously the extent to which law is an avenue for political contestation. And if we think just very narrowly about what's at stake with respect to the Supreme Court, I can list you very quickly a series of issues that were decided by 6-3 or 5-4 cases that involve disability, environmental justice, civil rights, labor unions, Fourth Amendment, voting rights, etc. We can run down the list of cases that were decided just over the past 5 or 7 years that have deep implications for everything we're talking to, right down to Indigenous sovereignty. And the pipeline of such cases are being constructed again. So when we think about politics, I just think it's important that progressives jettison the tendency to poo-poo law and take it seriously as a domain for politics. Certainly that's what the right has done, and it's precisely why we're in the place we are now, but frankly, with respect to the Second Amendment.
Thank you, David, and thank you for that corrective. What we do not have is a way of popularizing a conversation about how law is shaping the game in every way conceivable. So thank you for bringing that back. Okay, we have several folks left just to give us a quick sort of 30-second wrap up so that we can, sort of get our marching orders and move forward. Ezra, what do you have for us?
Yeah, just a quick statement. I think it's important in this moment when many of us are so fearful to take to heart and remember that the dignity of our fellow human beings was not on the ballot on Tuesday. We might have lost our candidate. We might have lost a lot of local elections and a lot of propositions, but we must use this moment as a moment to remember that we need to resist. We need to step up. We need to rethink what went wrong and push forward and not resign ourselves to defeat. The next 4 years will be immensely difficult, but we can do this together.
Thank you, Ezra. Thank you so much. Alicia?
Oh, yes. Okay, 30 seconds now. Two things. So one, I think the thing that I want to leave us with is what are the strategies that we need to move that allows our resistance movements to stay above ground. So one thing that Donald Trump did say was that he was in favor of classifying Black Lives Matter, for example, as a terrorist organization. There's lots of conversation about kind of the ways in which state violence will become more severe, but we need to be thinking about in our organizing, how do we protect our ability to organize above ground, to resist above ground, because of a bunch of reasons. And then the last thing is, and I want to just give love to Robin for this, every time we face a moment like this, a tragedy, when we face chaos, or even just a crossroads, I always resort back to this thing about continuing to cultivate our revolutionary imagination. So being cynical will absolutely keep us from dreaming as big as possible, from risking and failing, but also imagining what to be next. So keep dreaming.
And on that note of coming next, Robin, what do you want to leave us with?
Yeah. In 30 seconds, I appreciate that. And I appreciate what Alicia said actually about the Midwest and thinking about when a lot of white progressives say, what can I do in support? They don't always have to show up to the demonstrations. You got to organize. I mean, it's an old idea, but organize white folks. But then the other thing, just two real quick things. One, we need to rebuild the sanctuary movement. And we're trying to do something here at UC to turn universities into the new sanctuary for those students and folks who are vulnerable, whether it's DACA students or people vulnerable as undocumented workers. And finally, among many, many other things, we've got to support those very liberated spaces, the worker spaces like the LA Black Worker Center and Strategy and Soul, and all these spaces that provide the space for what Alicia is talking about, space to basically think, dream, imagine, and protect ourselves. Because, Black Lives Matter has already been under pressure. It's going to be war. It's going to be outright war. And we've got to be able to protect these movements. And if we can't do that, we can't sustain ourselves. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Robin. Thank you. Dallas, what do you have for us? Our parting words.
I just want to say that as we look ahead to this incoming administration, we expect it to escalate its capacity for violence or bigotry or racism, that we must escalate our own capacity for empathy, dignity, and focused resolve to continue to dismantle the system that gives consent for such bigotry and racism. And I think that when we're talking about our children, I think that for me, in very personal terms, what I share with future generations is that this sense of fear or the sense of injustice is nothing new for us as marginalized communities, especially as Indigenous peoples, and that in the context of history that we have been through worse, and that we have the ability to step back and understand that the inherent beauty of our languages, our songs, and our experiences in the land itself does not be diminished, and that so therefore our power as people from which that power we pull from those core spaces is not diminished as well. And so we just have to continue to tap into that and continue to move forward with that inherent beauty always in front of us and present.
Thank you, Dallas. Thank you so much. Sumi, parting words, parting directions?
So I think for me, the question is, what does an intersectional politics require going forward in light of the challenges? And I think in light of, the immediates that people have talked about, the Midwest, the South, the international perspectives, the divide between rural and urban, of course, racial and gender gaps, I think it's twofold in the following way. I think one, we have to emphasize self-education in terms of learning about other movements that are fundamental to have a broad vision of justice. So that we are competent to understand what that broad vision entails. And I actually agree with Billa's point earlier that I think the feminist movement has done great work in this regard in terms of embracing not only intersectionality theory, but also practice. And so that's a big step forward. But in some ways, are we stuck there? So that we have to get out of the more comfortable space of self-education and expand to the other part, and that is what I would call value added. That whatever communities that we work with or that we're knowledgeable about, we actually have to push the envelope to get from red to purple and from purple to bright blue, right? So that we've got to take whatever skills are at our capacity in terms of whether it's grassroots organizing or law or some kind of technical computer skills or working with particular communities. We've got to take that and be serious about it and try to convert the map in terms of and triggering this broad love movement in terms of capturing the imagination, right, for justice at a national and international level.
Thank you so much, Sumi. And on the international level, Osmond, what do you suggest for us? What do you want to leave us with?
I think the low is global at this point. I think the bottom line, which I agree with every single person who's spoken, is we just have to roll up our sleeves and engage and find ways to cut ourselves to a politics coalition in the communities we find ourselves in, while bearing in mind the way it connects to the national and the global. I mean, I think that means trying to build a cross-racial, labor-centered platform on various issues, all of which are going to come under assault. I know disability was the question that was raised, and an example, obviously, is that we're about to lose health care coverage for people with pre-existing conditions. That's a real possibility, and that is an issue that we'll be able to build a platform that's coalitional. And I think, honestly, local is global. These are international human rights questions that come right down to the risk that our communities face immediately around us. I don't think there's any dimension of this on which we can engage today that isn't going to have both local and international repercussions. So we should build where we have strength and recommit to the coalitions that we've been working in and broadening them.
Thank you so much, Asla. And Eve, tell us your vision for the future. What do you want to leave us with?
Well, I think that sometimes the darkest, most volatile times crack open the ground for actually the most revolutionary, imaginative possibilities. And rather than seeing this as our doom, I think we need to see this as our possible uprising and our possible time of re-envisioning. And I also want to say, I think this time requires enormous generosity. Generosity meaning that we don't just see ourselves, we learn about other people, we learn about everybody's issues, we come out of our silos, we link our struggles, we link our ability to protect each other, and those with privilege need to learn to serve and need to listen and need to educate themselves. And I think actually what we have to do is turn our fear into the deepest action, the deepest resistance, and not at all cave in, but move forward in ways we have never moved forward before.
Thank you, Eve. And I want to take this time to thank everyone for joining us and offer a very, very special thank you to all of our panelists. This has been an inspiring and utterly necessary conversation, and we want to continue to have these conversations. We want to urge you to listen, to keep up with them, have conversations with your friends, with your families, within your communities, and across social media. We also want to encourage you to follow the campaigns and the activism of the folks who've been on this phone. You know many of them, you know their work. Continue to stand with Standing Rock, continue to stand with Black Lives Matter, continue to read and agitate and be part of this growing movement. We also want to invite everyone who can join us to address Say Her Name. Next Sunday, November 20th, AAPF will be hosting a night of action and art and action at the New Eureka Cafe. It will Billion Rising is also structuring its annual February efforts to support solidarity against exploited women and